Tensions between the South and the emerging Republican Party had been building for years before Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860. Republicans were increasingly viewed across the South not simply as another political faction, but as a sectional northern movement fundamentally hostile to the expansion and eventually the survival of slavery and the Southern social order built around it. Lincoln won the presidency with only about 40% of the popular vote because the Democratic Party split between northern and southern wings, allowing him to carry the Electoral College without winning a single Deep South state. To many Southerners, this seemed to prove that they had lost meaningful influence inside the Union and could now be permanently outvoted by a northern industrial majority, even though Democrats had dominated national politics for much of the preceding decades. The reaction was immediate and explicitly tied to slavery. Seceding states such as South Carolina, Mississippi, Texas, Georgia, and Virginia issued declarations identifying slavery, abolitionism, and threats to white supremacy as central reasons for leaving the Union. Southern leaders feared not only immediate abolition, which Lincoln did not initially advocate, but the long-term containment and political isolation of slavery inside a republic, increasingly shaped by free state demographics and Republican ideology. At the center of the crisis was a profound contradiction. The Confederacy sought to preserve a hierarchical slave civilization, while still operating within an American constitutional tradition rooted in Enlightenment ideas about liberty, natural rights, property, and self-government. For decades, this contradiction had been partially contained through compromises like the Three-Fifths Compromise, which strengthened slave state influence inside the federal system while binding the South to it politically. Had the South existed entirely outside the American constitutional tradition, its arguments may have evolved into a more openly aristocratic defense of regional sovereignty and permanent hierarchy. Instead, Southern leaders had to justify slavery inside a republic whose founding ideals constantly generated moral and political pressure against hereditary labor systems. By 1861, Lincoln's position was that secession itself was unconstitutional and that the federal government had both the authority and obligation to preserve the Union. The conflict therefore became more than a dispute over local autonomy. It became a direct confrontation over whether states could legally leave the Republic when national elections produced outcomes they rejected. This also explains why large numbers of non-slave-holding whites still joined the Confederacy, even though roughly 75 to 80% of Southern households owned no slaves, and perhaps 95% of individuals did not personally own them. Slavery was not merely a labor system benefiting a tiny planter elite. It formed the foundation of an entire cultural, racial, political, and philosophical order that shaped Southern identity. Concepts of honor, religion, local authority, economic aspirations, and social hierarchy. Many ordinary whites believed that if slavery collapsed, the entire Southern world would collapse with it, including their own status within society. To them, the system represented not only wealth or labor, but civilization itself. Before the Civil War, the United States lacked a fully unified national currency system. Thousands of state-chartered banks issued their own paper notes, and their value depended heavily on confidence in both the issuing bank and the political future of the region. Secession therefore triggered immediate financial panic because Southern wealth, land values, commercial credit, and paper currency all depended on whether the Confederacy could survive as an independent nation. Many Southerners understood that if the Union crushed secession, Confederate currency and Southern financial institutions could collapse beneath the dominance of federally backed greenbacks and an emerging national banking system. During the war, the Union accelerated the shift towards centralized finance through the National Banking Acts, which tied banking to federal bonds and gradually pushed state bank notes out of circulation. Confidence in Confederate paper money rose and fell with military success. As defeat became more likely, Confederate currency rapidly depreciated because people understood its value depended entirely on Confederate independence. In this sense, many Confederates believed they were fighting not only for political sovereignty, but for the survival of an entire regional financial order whose land, debts, banks, and paper wealth risked subordination to a federally dominated economy after reunification. Historians have shown that Confederate propaganda consistently framed the war not as a rebellion for planter interests, but as a desperate struggle for survival against an aggressive northern state supposedly controlled by radical abolitionists. Newspapers, sermons, speeches, patriotic songs, rallies, and public ceremonies warned that defeat would bring social collapse, race war, confiscation of property, humiliation, and the destruction of local self-government. Confederate messaging repeatedly invoked images of slave uprisings, violated homes, burned farms, and submission to centralized rule in order to fuse personal honor with military service. At the same time, newspapers on both sides functioned less as neutral journalism than as political weapons. Editors coordinated narratives through telegraphs, party networks, selective reporting, and constant repetition, creating tightly controlled information environments that shape public perception daily. Southern editors portrayed Lincoln as a tyrant, intent on destroying the Southern way of life, while subordinating the South, economically and culturally, to Northern industrial capitalism. Studies of Confederate soldiers' letters and diaries reveal that most described their motivations through the language of liberty, independence, home defense, masculinity, and resistance to invasion. Yet these ideas were deeply intertwined with slavery and race, even among non-slaveholders. Many soldiers explicitly feared that emancipation would destroy the racial hierarchy that gave poor whites social standing, undermine household authority, collapse local economies, and erase the distinction between white citizens and black laborers. Other historians argue that enlistment was not simply spontaneous patriotism. Southern men had already spent years inside intensely politicized local cultures, shaped by newspapers, courthouse debates, militia traditions, election campaigns, and party rallies. Communities had therefore developed ideological networks capable of rapidly transforming political identity into military mobilization once war began. Research on Southern yeoman farmers further shows that many non-slave-holding whites were not outsiders to the slave system, but participants in a broader social order structured around it. Slavery influenced land values, labor competition, social prestige, and hopes for upward mobility. Even farmers without slaves often believed their independence and future prosperity depended on preserving the plantation economy and racial hierarchy organizing Southern society. Confederate newspapers such as the Richmond Examiner, Charleston Mercury, New Orleans Picayune, and Houston Telegraph amplified these fears constantly, depicting Republicans as fanatics bent on racial equality, confiscation of land, economic collapse, and military occupation. Resistance was portrayed as the only way to preserve white status, family honor, local autonomy, and economic survival. At the same time, historians have also shown that slavery often harmed poor whites economically. Works such as Masterless Men, The Roots of Southern Populism, and Masters of Small Worlds argue that slavery concentrated land, wealth, and political power into the hands of planter elites while depressing free labor opportunities, discouraging industrialization, and driving many poor whites into debt or landlessness. In regions with fewer slaves, especially Appalachia, East Tennessee, northern Alabama, western Virginia, and the Ozarks, opposition to secession was far stronger, and some poor whites resisted conscription, deserted, sheltered Unionists, or fought for the Union. The reality, therefore, was divided and deeply contradictory. Many poor whites suffered economically under the slave system and resented planter dominance, yet large numbers still supported the Confederacy because racial solidarity, local loyalty, fear of upheaval, and attachment to Southern identity outweighed purely material interests. Slavery functioned not only as an economic institution, but as the foundation of an entire racial, cultural, and political world that many ordinary whites still identified with and feared losing. The intellectual core of Confederate ideology was therefore broader than states' rights alone. Southern thinkers such as George Fitzhugh argued that the plantation order represented a superior alternative to industrial capitalism, wage labor, and mass democracy. In works like Sociology for the South and Cannibals All, Fitzhugh claimed that Northern wage labor was more brutal than slavery because factory workers could be discarded without obligation, whereas slaveholders supposedly maintained paternal responsibility for laborers from birth to death. He believed the South had solved the class conflict, destabilizing Europe and northern cities by establishing a permanent hierarchical order that prevented labor radicalism, urban poverty, and revolutionary unrest. Versions of these ideas spread through Southern newspapers, churches, and political culture, which portrayed Northern capitalism as spiritually corrosive, socially atomizing, and economically predatory. A world dominated by bankers, speculators, factories, and immigrant labor competition, rather than rooted landholders and stable communities. This is why Confederate propaganda so often attacked not only abolitionism, but also Yankee capitalism, centralized finance, and industrial monopolies. Many Southerners believed that if the Confederacy failed, their entire social order would be inverted. Local elites would lose authority to Northern financiers. Independent farmers would become trapped in debt and wage dependency, and communities built around land, hierarchy, kinship, and honor would be swallowed by impersonal industrial systems. Confederate newspapers therefore described the war in apocalyptic, civilizational terms. Defeat would not merely end slavery, it would destroy what many Southerners viewed as an organic, aristocratic society rooted in hierarchy, paternalism, local sovereignty, and agrarian stability. Southern intellectuals frequently romanticized ancient Rome and Greece because they believed modern industrial capitalism had severed society from hierarchy and moral obligation, replacing communal bonds with contracts, profit, and cash exchange. Within this framework, slavery was defended not simply as profitable, but as socially stabilizing and protective against the insecurities of industrial wage labor. The claim that most Southerners did not own slaves therefore misses how deeply embedded slavery was within Southern ideas of civilization itself. Even non-slaveholding whites often believed the system protected their racial status, upheld social order, restrained capitalism's destructive tendencies, and preserved a world in which they still possessed honor, political identity, and the possibility of advancement beneath an elite class, claiming paternal responsibility for society as a whole. In the end, most non-slave-holding Southern whites fought for the Confederacy not because they personally owned slaves, but because slavery formed the foundation of an entire social order that shaped their understanding of freedom, status, religion, politics, economy, and civilization itself. Southern propaganda, political culture, and intellectual life convinced many that the Republican Party, industrial capitalism, centralized federal power, abolitionism, and Northern finance threatened not merely slavery, but the destruction of their whole world. Even many poor whites who suffered materially under the plantation system still feared that Northern victory would overturn racial hierarchy, erase local self-government, reduce them to wage labor competition, and dissolve the social order that gave them identity and status. Yet the South was never fully united. Anti-Confederate sentiment, class resentment, and resistance to planter rule remained real throughout the war, especially in poorer upland regions. The Confederacy survived as long as it did because enough ordinary whites ultimately identified with its racial hierarchy, honor culture, local loyalties, and anti-modern worldview that they saw its survival as inseparable from the survival of their society itself.